Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Jessie Norman, Global Analyst Relations Lead covering our application services portfolio here at NTT DATA. I'm excited to welcome you all to our video podcast this morning, dedicated to modernization with a little bit of a special focus on mainframe modernization. It's a gorgeous morning here in Texas. We've all joined together with our favorite morning beverage from a local coffee shop here in Plano, and I'm privileged to share this table with three brilliant thought leaders in this space. From NTT DATA, right here next to me, I have Glenn Foley, VP of Application Modernization, sitting in our Consulting and Digital Transformation Services division. Welcome, Glenn.
Thanks, Jessie. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks. Next to him, we have Imran McMillan, Senior Director, leading our applications portfolio from a digital offering strategy point of view.
Thanks, Jessie. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, thanks so much. And of course, our esteemed guest from Forrester Research, Senior Analyst Brent Ellis, serving tech leaders, helping them solve their most complex enterprise problems.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I used to be a teacher, and I used to write lesson plans thinking about the outcome in mind. What do I want my students to walk away with? So let's maybe think about it in that way. Let's start with the outcome in mind, and that is to say, what is it that our clients need? What are those outcomes that they are looking for to come out of a modernization project? So I'm going to first send this question to you, Brent. What do we even mean by modernization? What does that modernized state look like for a client?
I mean, in a lot of ways, it depends on the client, right? And I think this is something that a lot of vendors in the space need to really pay attention to, is that the modernized state for a particular business is going to be a little bit different depending on what their industry is, how their communication with their customer is, what regulations and compliance they fall under. But generally speaking, it's kind of putting all of the applications, the code, the services, their entire tech stack into a rotation that they can easily manage over time. Really kind of building in the structure to deal with, that crazy term technical debt. Which probably gets overused, but the problem is that it's really easy to extend that technical debt to make your systems last longer and longer in order to meet some budget shortfall or something. And then what happens is you get in a real bind and you're not able to deliver to your customers the value that they expect from you. And I think that's where a lot of the market is right now. I think that's why there's a lot of big push on modernization. You guys have obviously seen the ways that you modernize, whether you're moving towards a DevOps environment or acquiring composable SaaS services or using Kubernetes or using cloud or whatever. But really, I think the core of it is getting to that point where you can have a tech stack that is easy for you to address your business needs on an ongoing basis.
I think it's really interesting to think about the outcomes. And when you think about, when we talk about modernization, you have to talk about the tech stack. You have to talk about the systems. But being able to describe it more in qualitative sort of business terms is really tricky for people. So when we think about, what's the modernized state, when we take those conversations to clients, we talk about, how we describe the state. Do you have business resilience, for instance? Are you able to really adapt if your business, if your industry is facing disruption? Are you providing digital experiences? Are you creating sort of human-centric experiences that actually improve satisfaction, not just for customers but for employees, for partners alike? Are you using data to drive your enterprise as a critical piece? A lot of our customers who we would say are not as modernized are using data to run their businesses for sure, but are they using data to drive intelligence and make decisions about their business? Are they using AI and ML for analytics and making that happen? And then what's the attention being paid to workforce transformation? Training talent, acquiring talent, growing talent, that's important, but also introducing automation and creating a culture of innovation. Those are sort of qualitatively the things that we talk about. And then we look back at the tech stack and say, are your systems, is your technology enhancing those characteristics or not, or neutral? And if you're not enhancing those characteristics, you're not at the modernized state.
Interesting. given those four categories that we just talked about here that are important in NTT Data and how we serve our clients, business resiliency, digital experience, the data-driven enterprise, and workforce transformation. Brent, given those four, do you see any of those as more important to successful modernization programs than the others?
So I think all four kind of are part and parcel. Like, you kind of don't get one without the other, but I think the middle two are the ones that really have to drive you forward from the technology, refresh point of view. You want to acquire digital experiences so you're serving both your customers and your employees better, and you're streamlining all of the processes that are involved internally and externally for your business. And you're using data to drive that, to choose where that happens. And ideally, you're using data that's, in a sense and respond manner, kind of doing that automatically if possible. But you get the other two outcomes from it as well. The sort of sad thing is what kind of initiates this conversation more often than not is a cost question. And I think one of the things you have to do, and one of the things I do with my clients a lot, is really kind of steer them away from cost savings and kind of talk to them. It's not that you're saving costs, it's that you're moving where the costs are, how you attribute them to your business. And ideally, you're improving the value of your tech stack. So cost isn't as much of a figure. You're really trying to drive up revenue rather than drive down cost.
One thing that I've seen that's sort of leveling the playing field for a lot of businesses, especially as it relates to cost-intensive, modernized end states, is consumption of SaaS and platform services. We're seeing a lot of small and medium-sized businesses able to compete more effectively because they're able to shift from a CapEx model to a license model and really use some of these configured platforms to enable customer experience or digital experience driving some of their business operations. And I think that's a really important point that you brought up, especially if you consider, our current economic climate. If you're looking at a vast IT portfolio that represents everything from back office to front office and customer experience, you probably don't have hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of dollars to do it all in one big bang motion. Ultimately, you're going to probably see a few interim states before your ultimate business transformation goals are achieved. And so that's really where I think SaaS and platform services really enable composability for businesses, especially when you're thinking about customer experiences. Maybe you don't have to rip out your mainframe and replace your transactional processing behemoth, but instead you can throw a new web GUI on a particular customer-facing piece of your application that can really drive adoption, drive new customers, drive new market penetration, while at the same time not incurring excessive transformation costs. So I definitely see that as playing into some of the trends that you're seeing as well.
Yeah. And Ron, I'm going to press a little maybe higher level with that. Sure. So how do you think economic austerity impacts decision-making or prioritization for that target state modernization that we're talking about?
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, like Brent said, modernization does often come down to budget, right? And if you're talking about budget, you're going to ultimately be talking about prioritization. So it becomes a business decision. Are you going to prioritize upgrading your infrastructure? Are you going to prioritize upgrading the user experience for your customers? Are you going to prioritize streamlining your operations within the business units themselves? You're sort of faced with a series of decisions depending on the scope of the portfolio modernization and ultimately the cost and budget that you're working with. So when we talk about an austere climate, that typically means that businesses might not be seeing as much growth, as much revenue, as much customer utilization of their products. So ultimately that's going to be a downward pressure for their budgets and for their transformation funding. So I think in times like this, sometimes the cost savings angle does come into play because you can use it to be a stepping stone towards larger modernization imperatives. So I think that's somewhat what we're seeing, a little bit more of a focus towards point solutions, towards really high impact upgrades, and maybe a backing down from large-scale global transformation initiatives that would be, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to implement broadly. So we are seeing, a slight retraction in that area. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that businesses aren't trying to transform and stay modern, because they absolutely are. But it's more so, where are they focusing their money and how are they sort of executing on that budget?
Yeah. It's a little bit dangerous, right? If we go back to what you were saying, Brent, about the idea of it's not just about saving costs, it's about transferring cost to where it needs to go. Mm-hmm. So in a hard market, that becomes much more of a tactical focus, right? The ability to transfer that thought from immediate cost savings to investment where it needs to happen is a tough sell in a hard market. So you get a lot of what you were saying, Imran. You get tactical decision making, you get a shorter attention span, you have smaller projects, shorter time horizons, and a real serious demand for ROI much, much quicker than you would see it in a large scale program, I think.
I actually think that this is where a good modernization partner comes in really handy, because at least you have someone at that point that's driving the modernization backlog. Mm-hmm. So when you've chosen the priorities for what you want to get done first, you then have someone saying, but don't forget about this, because it's so easy. Once you've done the shiny new thing in the front, to leave the spaghetti mess behind you. And really, businesses need to get into a habit of cleaning that up on a regular basis. It's like I have to clean up after my toddler on a regular basis, otherwise my house is destroyed, right? It's the same sort of thing. You need to build that into your structure and how you run your business. And I think that's one place where modernization partners can kind of handhold companies through it and model it, not just modernize and then get out. And really make sure that people are addressing that modernization backlog of things that weren't on the first priority list, but really do need to get done.
I love the concept of the modernization backlog, but would you say, Brent, that modernization backlog and technical debt are sort of the same body of work?
Sort of. I think what happens is, you immediately have technical debt the moment you modernize, right? It's just like driving that new car off the lot. You're already depreciated. But the point is, you need to pay attention to, the fuel economy and how safe the car is and all of that stuff. Same in your business. You need to find that tipping point where whatever you've done technically starts to lose value, and you need to readdress it. And that's the point where you go from technical debt to toxic technical debt. You can use debt wisely. People do that all the time. Businesses leverage debt in order to buy other businesses, in order to drive revenue growth all the time. But there's a point where you either overcommit or you don't pay down your debt fast enough, and then it becomes a problem. And that's what I mean by managing the modernization backlog. It has to be something that you cycle through on a regular basis and be like, what, we need to hit this because it's dragging us down.
We're definitely going to touch on how those modernization partners, we'll dig a little bit deeper into that later, as well as touch on toxic technical debt, I think, again, in a few questions. So let's maybe, now that we've sort of defined this modernized state, let's really focus in on the client needs. Imran, I've heard you mention this term persona-based modernization before. Can you, before we kind of dig deep into that, can you tell me what NTT Data means by persona-based modernization?
Yeah, absolutely. So ultimately, it's important to address not only where the purchase authority is coming from, but where the modernization imperative is coming from. And so when we talk about persona-based modernization, we're addressing who is initiating the scope of the modernization and what are their expected outcomes. So if you're dealing with, we've seen one market trend towards greater use of coalitions when it comes to driving IT modernization. And by that, we simply mean it's a broader base of stakeholders involved in the purchase decision for modernization. So you might be dealing with a CIO, a CTO, and even possibly a CEO, all working in tandem to understand the pain points of the current IT portfolio and where the most value can be achieved out of a modernization regime. And so that's one aspect of this whole persona-based, coalition-based pursuit of modernization. And then there's another major theme that's really going on, and that's really driving the purchase decision down to business unit leaders and away from the C-suite. You know, getting to this concept of, can you identify the product that ultimately leads to business revenue or other generating aspects of business operations? And so you're seeing that, you know, there might be a more hands-off approach from the C-suite as they allow individual business unit leaders to make specific modernization objectives completed or purchased for their particular products that they're managing or for their particular programs that they're involved in. And honestly, I think this has a couple of stated objectives or advantages, really. And one of them is intimacy with the product. You know, a business unit leader probably understands better, you know, what the labor requirements are to achieve the product value that they're trying to get to. They probably have a better understanding on how the different pieces of the organization come together to achieve that product pipeline. And therefore, they probably know more accurately where the most value can be gotten out of the spending that they're going to be putting forward towards modernization, whether it's, you know, re-architecting a group of applications, whether it's re-platforming their infrastructure, whatever the desired modernization outcome is. Business unit leaders do seem to be getting more broad-based support to really directly steer these purchasing decisions themselves. And ultimately, that is leading to some better business outcomes and really sort of separating the traditional IT cost center out of the conversation and really turning it back onto who's leading the particular product or value stream that they're looking to modernize. So really just tying it back to the question, you know, these are a couple of the main persona-based themes that we're seeing in the modernization market. And I'm sure that you guys have also been seeing themes in terms of who's purchasing, how are they purchasing, what groups of buyers are, you know, more successful in driving modernization forward. So yeah, I'll just keep it a little bit open here in case you guys have any points there.
For sure, we need to attend to different personas, and what you described, certainly we're seeing what you described. You know, the trickle down, the business decisions. The problem with that is to be able to make those decisions really well and really effectively without adding technical debt, you have to have already achieved what we described as business resiliency, right? You have to have that ability to adapt to business disruption, which means you have to be able to make atomic decisions. If you make a decision at a product level, that has to not add technical debt, which means it has to not impact all of the other shared systems. And so it's really problematic to have, you know, personas driving decisions in a strategic way and having a tactical impact only because, you know, the overall portfolio has not reached that sort of modernization outcome.
You know, and I think you bring up a point where the broader the scope of the modernization, the more likely that there is going to be to have a larger stakeholder or coalition group that's ultimately responsible for not only the scope but the execution of the modernization, right? If you're looking at maybe a group of 5 to 10 applications that ultimately support only one value stream within a couple major products for the organization, you know, that's probably a decision that a business unit leader can make on their own or with a certain amount of buy-in from, you know, associated services. But if you're talking about modernizing 1,000 applications across a very broad IT portfolio, then that's probably something you're going to have to bring in the CIO, the CTO to make sure that, you know, the overall strategy, architecture, and planning is considered in the purchase process. So when we talk about coalition buyers, that's probably more specific to larger scope modernization opportunities. So yeah, I think those are really good points.
Yeah. And, you know, kind of Imran talking about that coalition buyer and building the framework for what you're talking about, where the business leader can actually make a tactical decision. I think getting multiple personalities within the C-suite in line so that they can set the platform. So you can decide, like, what's the technology platform that achieves my business strategy? And then set the rules of play. You know, if you think about it like your company as a team, you know, the C-suite is setting the playbook. They're sharing, like, what are the moves that we're allowed to make when we're on the field. Right. and then they're giving some discretion to the players to execute when they're in that moment. And that's what your business leader or your product team leader is there to do. I think what we're seeing a transition from is this model where for the tech stack, it was all kind of a decision under the CIO. And everything that you wanted technology-wise went through a feature request to the CIO. That's no longer how businesses are making tech decisions.
Right.
You have tech decisions that are being driven by market conditions, by the business unit leaders, in order to capture value as quickly as possible. And so that modernization that needs to happen is setting a platform where those business leaders can make that decision in the moment, and it is in line with the overall business strategy.
You're giving me flashbacks to long meetings about CAB boards and change approval processes.
Right.
Yeah, that's when I think about traditional IT deployment, I think about CAB processes for just anything from adding a tool to changing an architecture to adding a web service to thinking about considering a new framework. Yeah, those kinds of long, onerous, very stepwise processes can actually hinder business transformation, especially if they're not handled in a sophisticated way.
Yeah.
Also, it really sort of reminded me of another sort of point, when you're talking about the differences between business unit purchasing and CIO level purchasing. What I've noticed is there seems to be a difference in the elasticity of demand for modernization services depending on which persona group you're actually looking at. And so when you think about business unit drivers for modernization, they're trying to improve the product for the end user, for the customer. And to your point, when you think about CIO level decisions for modernization, they're thinking about portfolio-wide architecture, setting the groundwork for a 5 to 10 year plan. So it might be much more broadly focused, and I think the demand for that kind of transformation is much more elastic. That's much more dependent on what are the revenues we're producing, how much budget, how much appetite do we have for this broad-scale 5-year transformation effort. And then when you look at business unit purchasing for modernization, it's more narrow in scope, it's more tactical, like Glenn was saying, and quite frankly, I think the demand for those is more inelastic. They have to be able to respond very quickly to customer input. If the customer says, we need a new feature to do this, and if that's going to drive a 20% increase in who's using your platform and who's using your product, then chances are the business unit leader is going to be very likely to invest. And so he can get to that decision a lot faster than a CIO who has to consider a lot of things before they float an RFP for a 5-year modernization effort. So that was something that just sort of came to mind as you were going through your dialogue there.
Yeah, two other points. But you need to have a framework for being able to do that investment on the fly.
Right.
And that requires that big platform, right? Because if you have a legacy IT stack that doesn't change quickly enough, or you have a purchasing and financing model that doesn't approve technology purchasing at the business unit level, then you're just put in a queue.
Right.
And you're waiting, and you're losing revenue, essentially. The other thing that I was thinking about is, that business unit leader is much more sensitive to the economic austerity, I think, than the C-suite. Because the C-suite does have to think in that 5 to 10 year strategic planning way. And a recession might only be 18 months. But there's still, another 4.5 years that they have to think about strategy-wise. And they need to be able to set the business up to build on that.
And a business level, a product level buyer is not going to aim for some of those, what we think of some of the critical modernization outcomes. They're not going to be looking at workforce transformation as a whole, right? They may or may not be able to drive, data-driven intelligence back into the enterprise.
Right.
They're probably, looking at digital experience as a primary outcome, but neglecting some of the others.
Yeah. One other thing about persona, though, is throughout all this, there just needs to be a bright line to both the customer and the employee persona. Now, when you think of workforce transformation, you have to think about your hiring strategy. Are your employees satisfied? Are you keeping them around?
Right.
When you're talking about the business model, data-driven insights, and all of that stuff, it's insights about your customer. How do they like to use your business? Are they actually staying with your business, or are they leaving? you need to be able to capture that as part of your tech stack. And there's a lot of like metrics and monitoring and transformation about how we get information about our customers that's changing at the same time. And then that all has to filter into a way that's consumable by first, the business or product leader, but then all the way up to the C-suite.
Certainly sounds like a great approach by putting the customer at the center, but there are some limitations and some challenges throughout.
Yeah.
It feels like persona-based modernization is a topic we could speak on for a really long time.
Right?
But I think we might break for the moment.